Thank you very much, Mr Cummings. It's my pleasure to raise with the House an issue that I have raised before, a few years ago, and very much in the spirit that prevention is better than cure, rather than raise an outraged adjournment debate when someone unsuitable is placed in open conditions and walks out. I thought it would be better to try and raise with the House my concerns about the people who are being sent to open conditions before things go wrong, in the hope that we can actually prevent them from going wrong. Mr Cummings, as the Minister will well know, I have Leyhill Open Prison in my own constituency. I've visited Leyhill on a number of occasions, including very recently. I certainly wouldn't want any view I express to be taken as representing anyone's views other than my own, though obviously it's been informed by people I've spoken to at Leyhill. But many of the comments I make will be equally applicable to the open prisons elsewhere in the system. And I want to start, Mr Cummings, with a very sincere word of praise for what goes on at Leyhill. It's absolutely clear that there is a set of people within the prison system, typically serving long sentences or sentences for some quite serious offences, who will come towards the end of a sentence who will not be ready to simply be sent out of prison into the community. If we simply took them from closed conditions out of the community, they might not cope, they might reoffend, who knows what might happen. And therefore I do believe, and I want to say right at the start of this debate, that I very much support the principle of open prisons. And I think that people in my local community, obviously the prison itself employs many people in my constituency, and people in my local community, I think, also accept the principle of the work that's done at Leyhill, and it's quite often that you go somewhere in the local area and you meet somebody who's actually at Leyhill, who's working in the community, getting back into the idea of discipline, personal responsibility, routine, these kind of things that will equip them better for life on the outside. And I think, Mr Cummings, that work is to be praised. I also want to praise a very dramatic turnaround in the problem of absconding from open conditions. If I look at a written answer I received on the 25th of July, sorry, the Shadow Home Secretary received, I apologise, on the 25th of July, with figures for the number of absconds from different open prisons, and looking at the one I'm particularly interested in, which is Leyhill, going from 2001-02 onwards, the number of annual absconds went from 19 to 33 to a peak of 114 in 2003-04, which is more than 2 a week, to 102 the following year, and 66 in the financial year just ended. Now, in fact, my understanding, the Minister probably will have more up-to-date figures than I have, but in the first 8 months of this calendar year, I'm told only 8 prisoners absconded. Now, obviously, 8 is 8 too many, and we would all accept that, we don't want anybody absconding, and clearly some of these people have committed serious offences. But clearly that is a dramatic improvement on what's been going on in the not-too-distant past, and I salute the work that's gone on at Leyhill to get that situation under control, the intelligence-led work that's gone on. But my key theme, Mr Cummings, is I am concerned that that good work and that progress is about to be undermined and jeopardised, both the good work on rehabilitation and the good work on cutting the number of absconds, if, and here is the key point, if open prisons are used as a kind of overflow car park, a sort of dumping ground for the prisoners who we can't find anywhere else for. Now, obviously, the public's attention to this issue was raised relatively recently, subsequent, in fact, to my recent visit to Leyhill, by a memo from, I believe it's the Governor of HM Prison Ford. And the Governor said that already in the autumn of last year, the open prisons were operating close to 95% capacity. But as I think she said, and I'm quoting here, the instructions coming down state that local prisons must review prisoners serving short sentences for non-sexual or violent offences who are relatively low risk and likely to be suitable for transfer to open conditions. And she goes on, we are likely to get more very short-termers, some who should really be in Category C conditions, and this will mean almost inevitably the abscond rate will go up in Category D prisons. Quotes, ministers have apparently been briefed to this effect and are taking this risk. Now, in a sense, there's no point being hysterical about this. That is all pretty much a statement of fact. The Home Secretary, when he made a statement to the House, I'm happy to give way.
Very good. And I do appreciate the spirit in which he's moving this. Just to say to him that it's not the government's position to comment on leaks, but I can say that that leak was completely wrong.
Well, I look forward to the Minister clarifying the sense in which that was wrong. But, for example, if I read just a few words that the Home Secretary himself said to the House on the 9th of October at column 33, which appears, in fact, to reinforce the leak, so perhaps the Home Secretary is wrong as well, it says, secondly, in providing maximum flexibility within the present estate to allow transfers to the open estate under severe restrictions, in addition to those transferred as a matter of course. In other words, we have a system that's going on of transfers to the open prisons, people being assessed, people being risk assessed, and what is clearly happening because of the pressure elsewhere in the system is, albeit the Home Secretary says under severe restrictions, but it's quite clear. We're talking, I mean, he says, the Home Secretary himself says, in addition. In addition to what? In addition to the people who would ordinarily be risk assessed as being suitable for open conditions, some more people are being sent to open conditions. Why is that? Because of the pressure elsewhere in the system. It's almost a statement of fact, it seems to be uncontentious, that that's what's going on. I have learned that there is something called an overcrowding draft. I don't know if that's a colloquialism or not, but it's certainly a term that I think is understood within the prison service. An overcrowding draft, where a closed prison simply can't cope on one night or one day, and Leyhill or another open prison is contacted at short notice often to say, can you take 5 lads, we can't fit them in our prison tonight. And I find that quite worrying. Now, I have tabled a written question for name day answer, which the Minister unfortunately hasn't been able to answer in time for this debate, which is regrettable, but I hope he's come with the information with him, because I've asked how much of this is going on. In other words, how often are overcrowding drafts being issued? Where are prisoners being sent from? Where are they being sent to? Who are they? How many are they? To which prisons? How long do they stay there for? All right, that's a very long question, and I don't expect the Minister to answer all of that. But I have no sense, no feel for the scale of this. Is it the case that Leyhill, and I've not asked the Governor directly, is it the case that they are regularly getting people just because things are overcrowded elsewhere? Is it exceptional? When they do get them, how long do they stay? Are they there for the rest of their sentence, or are they sent back? I think we do need this information. Yes, sure.
David Garnier.
For allowing me to intervene in this short debate. Is he aware of the expression churning, which means that prisoners are moved from prison to prison to prison without ever getting onto a training course, a rehabilitation course, and they are being churned because there is insufficient room in the prison estate as a direct consequence of a failure to plan by this government?
Steve Webb.
I'm indeed familiar with the expression churning, and he brings me on to a point that I will come on to later about the impact of this churning, this shunting around the system on the inmates themselves. Now, my understanding is that the numbers at Leyhill itself have risen by nearly 100 in 6 weeks. Now, on an initial population of a little over 300, that's a pretty dramatic increase. I'm not absolutely sure. The last official figures on the Home Office website are for August, so I don't know if those figures are up to date, or indeed if the numbers have come on more rapidly than that. But an extra 100 on 300 is a very substantial number of people to accommodate. Now, what's the problem with that? I think that there are 3 principal problems. The first is, if prison officers and prison staff are having to devote their time to taking in dozens and dozens of extra inmates, often at short notice, often in high volumes, they simply cannot do the day job properly. They simply cannot spend the time and effort on the rehabilitation work that they need to be doing. Prison officer time and management energy is being devoted to containing the short-term inmates, the overflow prisoners, instead of the long-term rehabilitation work that open prisons are almost uniquely well placed to perform. So it's stopping them doing the job that they're there for, and that is very damaging. Secondly, it's terribly bad for the morale of officers. They go into that kind of situation, often working with difficult offenders, often people who've committed very serious offences, because they believe in the possibility of rehabilitation, and yet they're not able to do it to the quality that they would want to because of the short-term pressure. So it's bad for morale. But as the honourable gentleman who intervened on me pointed out, it's actually no good for the short-term prisoners who are being shunted from one part of the system to another. Because if, for example, there are problems with basic literacy, how can an inmate in prison be taught to read better if they're not actually in any one place long enough to do a course? How can they tackle offending behaviour if they're being shunted around all the time, if they're simply being treated as a whole series of successive high-security or low-security bed and breakfast establishments, rehabilitation goes out of the window and reoffending rates soar. And in a sense, this is one of the nubs of the argument. The concern here is not simply the welfare of the inmates, it's the welfare of the population who we don't want to see become the next victim of crime. And if we fail to rehabilitate inmates in closed or open conditions, we have more reoffending, more victims of crime, and more calls for locking more people up. And we end up in a downward spiral. And what's very striking, Mr. Cummings, I mentioned my own debate a couple of years ago on one very specific case, but we've been here before. I have in my hand the annual report of the Chief Inspector of Prisons for 2002-2003, and I think it was he at the time, though I may be wrong. In 2002-2003 said of open prisons, based on a review of all the inspections of open prisons during that year, open prisons play an important role, but they too are now receiving different kinds of prisoners for shorter periods. Population pressure, this was 4 years ago, population pressure has meant that open prisons are receiving prisoners who would not formally have been sent to open conditions at that point in the sentence. Some arrive without sentence plans, let alone work to address offending behaviour. Some also arrive barely detoxified. And you can start to see why the prison staff at somewhere like Leyhill have a heck of a job on their hands, even tackling the people who are coming in, trying to do anything meaningful with them. And I'd be grateful if the Minister can clarify how long these people stay for. When they come on an overcrowding draft, is it literally a bed for the night and they're off? Or are they then there for the duration? You know, is anything meaningful or long-term done with them, or is it literally just shunting around the system? And just to give one example that I think is true of Leyhill, but this is a reference to North Sea Camp Open Prison, the report says at North Sea Camp, some prisoners were arriving with only a week of their sentence to serve. Now, all right, they've got to go somewhere, but the idea that moving them at that point and expecting anything worthwhile to happen, it clearly can't. It simply can't. So if they're in for a fairly short period, then what is actually going to come of it? So great praise for what's been achieved. Just 8 absconds in the whole year so far is a fantastic improvement on over 100. So what should we be doing about this, Mr. Cummings, to wrap up? Well, first of all, clearly my constituents need to know that the security threshold is not being lowered for prisoners being sent to open conditions. We just have to know that regardless of the pressures elsewhere in the system, we're not just becoming an easy touch, because open conditions are just not suitable for lots of prisoners. It requires a degree of trust, a degree of maturity, a degree of responsibility, and many will just walk out. That's simply what will happen. And I think I fear the figures will start to bear out my prediction. So no lowering of the security threshold. But what else do we need to do? Well, clearly, we need to tackle, as ever, the causes of offending behaviour. I'm the Liberal Democrats' health spokesman, and I see what's happening in mental health. And it's absolutely apparent that mental health problems, psychosis, is extraordinarily prevalent in the prison population, and yet what we're seeing is a squeeze on mental health services. So at spending money up front to prevent, not simply tackling the consequences. The second thing we need is actually there are people in prison who we could get rid of now and free up spaces, which is foreign nationals, many of whom have actually completed the end of their sentence but can't be got rid of because the Home Office hasn't got the paperwork sorted. I'm chasing 2 cases at the moment of prisoners in my constituents who've been, one's ringing up daily saying, deport me, deport me. And I believe, finally this week, the gentleman concerned has been deported after the end of his sentence. He wanted to get out months ago to be deported, and yet that's taking up a space in the prison system, which means that there's more pressure to send people to open conditions. So if the Home Office could sort its paperwork out, I suspect hundreds, literally hundreds of prisoners who are in closed conditions could be sent home. And the final thing, I think, is that a lot of people who are in prison, frankly, in my judgment, it's not obvious, particularly non-violent first offenders. We're simply locking up too many of them. Now, it's not just soft liberals who say this sort of thing. The previous Home Secretary, but several, the Honourable Member for Sheffield Brightside, I think, said, and I quote, in March 2002, if anyone seriously believes a further exponential rise in the prison population for short-term prisoners and first-time offenders is the way to ensure our safety, then they are seriously deluded. And how right he was, at least on that occasion. Because, Mr. Cummings, ultimately, we've got to tackle the source of the problem. We've got to tackle mental health problems and behavioural problems that are part of, clearly not all of, but an important part of offending behaviour. But we've got to look at sentencing and punishment and serious community sentencing that means what it's called and actually achieves something for the community, has in many cases got to be a better bet and will mean less pressure on open prisons who have an important job to do and really need to be allowed to get on with doing it. So I hope the Minister can give my constituents today some information about who is being sent to open prisons such as Leyhill, how many, how often, what the pressures are, and can really give me guarantees that the security threshold is not going to be relaxed one jot, because without those assurances I think my constituents will be rightly concerned. And Mr Cummings, the very last thing I want to say in 6 to 12 months' time is I told you so.
Does the honourable member have the permission of Steve Webb?
Point of order, Mr Cummings. I did give consent to the honourable gentleman to intervene during my speech, which he asked me to, but I didn't give consent for a speech in the debate.
Mr Jerry Sutcliffe.
Thank you, Mr Cummings. Can I start off by congratulating the honourable member for North Avon for securing this debate. Can I also congratulate him on the work that he does with the prison at Leyhill and the other establishments that he's got in his constituency, which I read upon during his last adjournment debate on this matter. And clearly, if the honourable member for Harbour wants to intervene on me, I'm sure that he will do so at an appropriate time. The honourable member for North Avon gives me the opportunity to set the record straight, if you like, in terms of some of the issues affecting the prison estate. While the debate is talking about open prisons, there's clearly concerns about what's going on within the prison service and issues affecting the whole of the estate. But I think it was quite right, Mr Cummings, to start off by acknowledging the excellent work that's done in open prisons, 16 open prisons in England and Wales, but particularly in his own open prison, that of Leyhill. And he paid tribute to the staff, to the offenders themselves for what they have done there. And indeed, I'd like to pay tribute to the 15 prisoners a day working for Mead Construction, getting real qualifications at Leyhill so that they can come out into the wider community at the end of their sentences. And that's the nub of the question in relation to the open estate, is how we use the open estate. And the honourable gentleman was generous enough to say that the process is right. There are two parts to a sentence. There's the penal part of it, the custodial part, which is the punishment, if you like. Then there's rehabilitation that needs to take place. And that's clearly what the use of the open estate should be for. Because I know that honourable members would not want us just to release people without any attempt to rehabilitate, because the reoffending would reoccur. And I was happy that he did mention the issues about reoffending, and I'm sure that we'll be returning to that in terms of how the government wants to try and upgrade, if you like, the contribution from all involved in terms of reducing reoffending, and I look forward to that debate at a later time. Yes, Mr Cummings, the honourable member asked me a number of questions relating to Leyhill, and if I can do that now, I'll try and respond to that and then get back to the issue of prison capacity and the reassurances that he requires in terms of public protection and what we want to do in terms of building public confidence. The honourable member for Harbour. Well, the honourable member for Harbour raised the issue about what he perceived to be incompetence on behalf of the government. Obviously, I will respond to that, but I'll give him...
to intervene on his remarks. Before we come down to the detail of Leyhill, a constituency issue which obviously reads across into the wider issue of what we are doing with our prisons, could the Minister please deal with what I call the HMP Ford memo and fit that into the wider policy, if there is such a thing, of his department in relation to open prisons? Because the suspicion is, and it's not a suspicion simply based on ideas plucked out of the sky, but it's increasingly based on solid fact, that this government is using the open prison system as the honourable gentleman said, a dumping ground in order to deal with the overcrowded secure prison estate. And the public needs a huge amount of reassurance from this government, which...
Intervention should really be very brief.
Yes, well, this is a reasonably brief one, but I think the Minister's got the point.
Again, I'm grateful to the honourable member for making his intervention, and I will try to answer the points as we move along. But let's meet that one head on. I mean, this idea that there was no planning for the eventualities. I mean, let's look at where we were. 1997, when this government took over, there was, pressures on the prison population then. There's always been pressure on the prison population. Since 1997, there's been a 19,000 increase in capacity as far as prison places are concerned. And, we have been looking at the issue since the new ministerial team took over in May. A further 8,000 places were identified then, and there's another 1,000 and another 2,000 to meet some of the pressures that are there. And the Home Secretary quite clearly said in the announcements he made in terms of some of the short-term contingency plans that we have in place that we were going to use, if necessary, Operation Safeguard, and we acknowledge the fact that the prison population was at the highest it had ever been. And I agree with the Honourable Member for North Avon that we need to look at the prison population and we need to look at what's there and how we deal with people in terms of community sentencing, looking at all other alternatives that need to be in place. And I think that's a debate that we ought to have outside the frenzy of the ratcheting it up, I believe, of the media in terms of looking at this issue purely as a political issue and, dare I say, even a party political issue in terms of trying to expose perceived weaknesses. Where I think we are is that we need to have a look, and the government would have been blamed if we did not to maximise the use of the open estate. We would have been blamed of not trying to resolve the capacity issues. But the key point about the transfer from closed conditions to open conditions is the risk assessment. The risk assessment that's got to be carried out by the Governor to a set standard. And let me reassure honourable members right across the House and the public, there's been no change to that risk assessment. No change to how people are risk assessed. What there has been, that the Home Secretary and I have impressed upon the prison service, is that to maximise the use of the estate. But what has got to be fundamental has to be public protection and public confidence in what we're trying to achieve. And so there's been no changes in the categorisation of that. I fear that we will run out of time, Mr Cummings, and I don't want to miss the opportunity of answering the particular point on Leyhill in relation to what the Honourable Gentleman has raised. Leyhill has operated at considerably below its full capacity in recent months, and it's now moving nearer to full capacity. And clearly, prisons are resourced to operate at their full capacity. The general operating capacity of the open estate is 95% at the moment. Only prisoners who have passed the rigorous and robust risk assessment can be allocated to open prisons, and there's pressure for the prison service to maximise, as I said, the use of the estate, but the appropriate allocation to open conditions continues to be paramount. So, the public can be reassured that we are not moving people into open conditions that are outside the normal risk procedures that are in place. The Honourable Member mentioned the point about prison education, about what happens if you maximise the estate and how then that affects the ability to develop people in terms of reoffending or avoiding reoffending. I'm quite conscious of that. It's important that we make sure that the projects that are in place that contribute, and Leyhill is doing that, as we have said, to the maximum amount of trying to make sure that people are given the opportunity to rehabilitate back into society. Leyhill is doing that, but there are pressures clearly when the population rises, and we are going to make sure that we look at those issues in relation to the outcomes affecting them. But it would have been wrong of us not to try to maximise the estate given the pressures that we've got. But we are going to put the public at the paramount position, making sure that we protect them as we said we would do. The Honourable Member then raised the issue about absconders, and I think again it's a good point, and he praised the record that there is in Leyhill in terms of the abscond rate since over the last 5 years. And as he quite rightly said, that there have been dramatic improvements in terms of the number of absconders, or the reduction in the number of absconders. And he asked me for the figure for this year, and I think it's currently at 25, but I'll confirm that. So it clearly is showing the signs of improvement that he asked us to see. The abscond rate, as he's quite rightly said, has come down over the years. There are alternatives that we are trying to place other than open prison. He will be aware of home detention curfews, how we're trying to find ways to rehabilitate people. He will be aware of the Public Accounts Committee report that was recently published into the effectiveness of that scheme. Clearly there were issues to be addressed, that of making sure that prison governors know of their outcomes in terms of people going on home detention. There's clearly information that needs to be shared between prisons about the availability and the eligibility of people going on to home detention curfews. Because it's important that we look at the estate, look at the prison population and try and find ways of dealing with that in relation to how we can find alternatives that the public have confidence in. I was quite... yeah, sorry.
I appreciate sometimes it's very good. Could I get him to focus in just the few minutes he has on this issue of overcrowding drafts? How often are people being sent to places like Leyhill because other places are overcrowded, and what happens to them when they get there? Do they get sent back somewhere else, or are they there for the duration?
Very short, Cliff.
Yeah, to that particular point, as I said, there's still capacity in the estate. So some prisoners in the southeast, for example, are moved to the north where there's more space. And these are known as out-of-area transfers. So it's not overcrowding drafts, it's out-of-area transfers. And once they're moved there to an open prison, they stay there and they don't keep churning around. So it's a one-move policy that's in place. And that's to maximise the position relating to the capacity problems
how often
that we face. And the figure, as I said to the Honourable Member, for the Leyhill absconds from the 1st of April to the 16th of October is 25. Mr Cummings, the whole issue of sentencing, the whole issue of the capacity issues relating to the prison service are key to what the government wants to try and achieve. The Home Secretary has said that Operation Safeguard is not ideal, but again, that is putting something in place that stops us having to let people out of prison that are not, if you like, given the opportunity to get back into society. The home detention curfew scheme, I believe, is an ideal alternative. But as more people become eligible for the home detention curfews, you then are putting those people into open conditions because there's no need to, because you've found an alternative there. So that makes the population in relation to the open conditions different. But I think the key factor is that the risk assessment hasn't changed. Again, I'll give quickly.
Mr. Garnier?
The Honourable Member will ask a direct question, which the Minister said he would get back to, which was over the memo. Does the memo not exist? Did the memo exist, but the Governor of HMP Ford not understand it? Could he please give us a proper understanding of the position there? Because it touches directly upon the points that the Honourable Gentleman was raising, and he did ask that question directly.
Well, I thought I took the point in saying that the memo was wrong, but the position on the memo is that normally government wouldn't talk about leaks for the understandable reasons that I'm sure honourable members would accept. The reason why I said it was wrong was that that was an interpretation of what the government had said, and that's what I'm saying is wrong. And I'm trying to reassure the honourable member that the position that on risk assessments hasn't changed. Yes, the government has asked for the estate to be maximised in terms of capacity against that risk assessment so that people are not put in there that shouldn't be in there. And I think I can't be any clearer than that in terms of what the position is in terms of public protection. We want to protect the public. We want to make sure that we maximise the estate given the high number of people that are in prison at the moment. We want then to look at the prison population to evaluate what can be done to try and make sure that the most dangerous and prolific offenders who should be in prison are in prison. We then want to look at the rest of the prison population. One of the statistics, Mr Cummings, which I find amazing, is that of the 79,000 people in prison, less than 5,000 are women. And we could argue that that's too high in terms of some of the mental health issues that the Honourable Gentleman raised. But what does that say about the prison population that we've got? The people are usually young men who have themselves perhaps been victims in some cases. How we deal with that in terms of looking at how we can reintegrate those into society. I think there are many issues affecting the prison population. There are many issues that the staff, I believe, have to face. And I, again, put on record, and I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman, as he did, congratulated the staff in what they've done in terms of making sure the public are protected, but are trying to rehabilitate people, trying to give support to individual prisoners in many ways. And I believe that we need to have a serious discussion in this country about why we have that high prison population, why per head of population we imprison more people in the UK than anywhere else in Europe. And we need to have that debate quickly, not just because of the prison capacity issues, but how society is going and how we need to try and address some of the problems that are there. What we've got to be careful of is that people don't become risk averse. Now, I'm very cautious when I say that, because, as I've said, we haven't changed any of the criteria. But I want to be in a position where judges, where...
Order. We have to move on now to the next debate.